Hey gunfighters, welcome back to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, ballistics, tactics, defense, hunting, survival, the right way with God Almighty at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I'm blessed to serve you as host today. Bio is in the show notes. What are we going to talk about today? How about the 277 Fury versus the 7mm back country? The marketing is strong with these two rounds. And kind of both of their big claim to fames are they're loaded to 80,000 psi. For those of you that are not ballistics nerds, that's okay. Traditionally, like the ceiling was 65,000 psi. Many things are well under that. 62,000 is pretty common, and the 50,000s is pretty common. And these are all like modern high-pressure rifle rounds, bottleneck Spitzer cartridges. But heretofore, there have been no 80,000 or even close to that PSI rounds. Well, both of these rounds hit that 80,000 PSI as a standard pressure in that cartridge. So that's the main thing they have in common. But how do they compare? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first one that came out that was announced was the 277 Fury. It was announced in conjunction with the M5. Well, it was originally the XM, and then became the M5, and then the M7, because I guess the M5 was already a rifle by Colt. So it's the M7, supposed to replace the M16 and M4 in military service. It seems to be marching pretty slow, but we'll see if it gets there. Anyway, that's outside the scope of today's discussion. The fact is they developed it in conjunction with that M7 military variant of the MCX Spear. It is, I'm not going to say it's exactly, but it's very similar to a 308 case necked down to 277. The same caliber as the old school 270. We'll get into numbers later, but if you look at the numbers and you look at the old school 270 that came out, I think, in 1925, you're like, it's basically a 270? And I would say, yeah, for hunting, I mean, it's unless you have specific need for its attributes, it really doesn't do anything that the 270 doesn't do. Now, calm down. If you compare like M7 ballistics to traditional 22, 24-inch barreled 270s. However, 270, that's going to have a much longer barrel, generally in a hunting rifle. It's also going to be a long action. The 277 Fury does it in a short action, meaning a 308 length cartridge, and it achieves those velocities out of a much shorter barrel. If you're looking at shooting it out of a 16-inch barrel, right, that could be important. How do they do that? They do it by cranking up the PSI to 80,000. That's how they do that. And they do it by, and this is one of the major differences in the technology of these two cases, they do it with a bi-metal case. For a long time, the limitation has not been that the rifle chambers can't handle the pressure. The rifle steel in the barrels can't handle that. We've had that technology for a long time. The issue was the brass case itself. A lot of the pressure, it has to be contained even though it's in the chamber. The case has to hold that. The majority of that pressure, if a case ruptures, it'll generally rupture at the back of the case. Well, the back of this case, the web of this case, is steel. and it's joined somehow, amalgamated, vulcanized. I don't know exactly how they do it, but they join it to a regular brass case, and then the base, the back of it, is a steel alloy, and it's called their bimetal case. Not bimetal as in like copper washed or something, but bimetal case is in the front half is traditional brass, and then the back half is steel, joined together. Let me talk about that for a little bit. That seems like it's more complicated. With more complication, probably comes more cost, more complexity. That said, they do make a regular brass case variant of it for training, for just if you don't need all that pressure, don't want all that pressure. And that's basically just going to be like a short action neck down 308. Really nothing special there. And I think the idea for this is the military will train with the regular brass case loaded to whatever normal PSIs. It may be 65,000, it may be even lower than that. But regular kind of standard plain vanilla PSIs. And then when it's time to start giving people supersonic lead poisoning in real life, they'll switch to the hotter 80,000 PSI rounds. So that's kind of their technology. Now let's talk about the other major difference in these two, besides the fact that one uses the bimetal case. .277. That has been around since 1925. For a long time it was only the 270. The 270 was really the only 27 caliber. Or in metric, 6.8 by 51 would be its designation. I think the 270, the 27 caliber, it's a real sweet spot for medium-sized game, and it's good ballistically. Generally, you're looking traditionally at the 130 grain weight range. Now, there's different bullet weights available in any caliber pretty much, but 130 has kind of been the classic sweet spot. Now, this is a SIG round. SIG has a factory loading, just their regular brass case, not bimetal. They list a 135 grain round at 2750. And again, that's not crazy fast, but it's with a 16-inch barrel. Numbers are respectable, and that's just a regular brass round. They do list a much heavier 155 grain, heavy for caliber, right? Heavy for caliber. 155 grain 277 Fury in their bimetal case for hunting at 3,000 feet a second, but that's out of a 24-inch barrel, so a little confusing there. Give credit, I got both those loads off of Midway USA. They have that ammo listed on their site. I'm not sponsored by Midway. They're just a good site. I've used them for so long that my password is my old badge number from L.A.P.D. I don't know which one of these, or if a different one will be the official military adoption. It's likely to change. I mean, it did with the 5.56. They went from the 55 grain, what is an XM193, to the M855. Now there's a lot of the Mark 262, so it might change over time, but this is per Wikipedia. They list load data for 135 grain hybrid match at 3,000 feet a second from a 16-inch barrel. Again, those velocities and everything, that's not much different than a regular 270, but the 270 would be out of a longer barrel. So that's really the big claim to fame to this, right? The other thing that I wanted to point out is that 27 caliber, right? .277. To make this easy to understand, I know we don't use a lot of metric, but you probably know how small a millimeter is. In metric, the NATO designation 6.8 by 51, 6.8. The next one we're going to talk about is the 7 millimeter backcountry. You're talking about not 2 millimeters, 0.2 millimeter difference. Now, we'll probably come back to it, but let's talk about the 7 millimeter backcountry. The big difference in this round is that it uses a steel case. Now, steel case has been around a long, long time. Maybe I should do a whole episode on steel cased ammo versus brass ammo. Traditionally, you think of steel case ammo as cheap garbage, like Tula ammo, Wolf ammo, the stuff that I would only advise you to shoot through some nasty com block stuff. But not always, right? And not everything that's silver looking is, this is important, not everything that's silver looking is a steel case. Not everything that looks like brass is a brass case. You got to kind of take a magnet to it to tell. A lot of really good high-end brass stuff is nickel plated, which kind of makes it look like steel for those that haven't been in the game a long time. But traditionally, steel case has been the cheap garbage ammo because it's cheaper to produce. However, steel is stronger. And I think Federal calls this their peak alloy, which I don't know what that means, right? All steel is an alloy. Newsflash. Iron is the element. Ferrocerium. Is it Fe on the periodic table if memory serves me correct? I'm not going to look it up. Ferrous. Iron, that's the element. Any steel is an alloy, meaning it's iron mixed with different things. I don't know what their secret sauce is on the peak alloy, but it's a steel case. Steel cased ammo. So that's how they're achieving the 80,000 psi. Instead of using the bimetal and regular brass with a steel base, they're just using a whole steel case. This is not a short action cartridge. This, and not exactly, just like there's probably some differences. The 277 Fury is probably not exactly a 308 neck down to 277 with a bimetal case. This is probably not exactly a 308 neck down to 7mm with a steel case, but if you look at it on paper next to like a 280 AI, come on. This smells very much like a 280 with a steel case loaded to higher pressure. So you've got a long action. This cartridge is a long action, and although there is some crossover in some rounds marketed for hunting for the 277 Fury, it was primarily designed as a combat cartridge. The 7mm backcountry is designed as a hunting cartridge to be shot out of bolt actions, not a fighting rifle. It's a standard length or long action length rifle cartridge, like a 30-06, like the original 270. It's that length, and it's 7mm. And it's a steel case, not a bimetal case, loaded to 80,000 psi. Now, for a long time, jumping back to 277s, the original 270, that was the only kit on the block in .277 bullet diameter for a long time. But in recent decades, there have been like the 270 WSM, the 270 WISM. There's been some Wildcats, but it really hasn't been a super... Oh, there was a 6.8 SPC. Right, so there's been a few, but 7mm was one of the original, maybe the original military-adopted, modern, high-velocity, Spitzer bullet, brass-cased, bottlenecked rounds in the 7x57 Mauser. And since then, there have been countless, I mean, maybe not countless, but so many that I can't remember even half of them, 7mm cartridges. 7mm 08, 7x57 Mauser, 284 Winchester, 280 AI, 7 Rem Mag, 7 Psalm. All right, there's a whole bunch. So there's a lot more bullets available in 7mm than there are in 277. So this one's a 7mm cartridge. Many, many more bullet options available in the 7mm than the 270. Also, 7mm is slightly bigger than 6.8, right? Obviously. So the bullets are going to generally be heavier in general. And this is an 80,000 psi cartridge in a long action or standard length action. 30-06 length action. So it's going to be more powerful. It is. Now, they have a Barnes LRX loading in 7mm backcountry. This is straight from the Federal website. It's their cartridge. Lists 168 grain at 3150. They list a Federal Fusion 175 grain at $31.25. This is a Magnum cartridge, right? The 7mm backcountry. For a long time, everybody was naming everything Magnum, and they kind of got away from that. I think the public kind of got sick and tired of Magnum. But make no mistake, it's a Magnum. Now, this might ruffle some feathers, but this really doesn't do anything the 7mm Rem Mag doesn't do. I know there's some nuance there, and I'm oversimplifying, but unless you're going to shoot and hunt with a shorter barrel, really those numbers aren't anything that the 7 Rem Mag or the 7, Ultra Mag, the 7mm STW shooting times Western, which this kind of reminds me of, right? Those numbers are not like earth-shattering. But the difference, again, is 80,000 PSI, and they're achieving respectable velocities out of shorter barrels. Does that matter to you? I don't know. That depends on you, right? Now, I wanted to point something out here. I think it's kind of ironic that the 277 Fury is made for a combat cartridge, and a lot of people that do a lot of that training and shooting will be high volume shooters. Not a lot of them reload. Some do, but it's a pretty small percentage of slice of that pie, that Venn diagram. But the bimetal case, I think, can easily be reloaded. The 7mm backcountry is kind of a high-end Gucci hunting cartridge. High-end rifles, mostly. Expensive ammo, expensive cartridge for high-end hunters and shooters and ballistics guys, and a lot of those guys do reload. And I know they say the 7mm backcountry can be reloaded, but it requires a lot of specialty stuff. It seems to me like they should be flip-flopped. Maybe Federal and SIG can do a patent swap. I don't know if that's a thing, but it seems to me if you're making really high volume military cartridges for shooting, for training for the military, why not just make them out of steel? And then for the really high-end hunting cartridge, so you can reload it, because a lot of those guys are going to want to reload and tweak their own hand loads, why don't you give that the bimetal case? So that you can just resize it just like any other brass case. Because generally the neck and things like that is what has to be resized and trimmed. Seems to me like the technology there is flip-flop from what it ought to be. But that's just my opinion. I haven't heard anybody else point that out, but it seems a little strange. But again, the 80,000 PSI thing is pretty new for a standard, a SAMI spec standard. So we're kind of in uncharted waters here. Really, overarchingly, the only real similarity is that these are both 80,000 PSI cartridges. They both use some kind of steel in the case somewhere to hold those pressures. They're vastly different. You can obviously use them for both things. I can cut into butter with a spoon, but a butter knife is better. A butter knife is what it's made for, cutting into butter. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Well, you can use, just because one is designed for one thing doesn't mean you can't use it for another. You can certainly hunt with the 277 Fury, but it was designed as a combat cartridge. You certainly could use a 7mm backcountry in a DMR rifle or something, but it was designed as a hunting cartridge. So, although they're both 80,000 PSI, they're pretty different. One is a short-action combat cartridge developed for use in a, self-loading weapon. One is marketed as a long-range hunting cartridge, basically a new 7mm Magnum, designed for longer action, bolt-action rifles. So that's kind of my summation of both cartridges. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you listening. Your tactical verse of the day: you shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. It can be a dark world out there, men. Be a light in that world. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.